Early Sambar hunts. In 1974, I was selling musical instruments and records in my father's Bairnsdale shop. I received the basic wage and annual holidays. There was not a lot of time to hunt, as the shop was open on Saturday mornings. I can recall driving out the highway before starting work just to see how much snow was on the Alps, how those mountains call you. Although I had saved up enough money to upgrade my rifle to an Anschutz 270, the rest of the outfit was still very basic. Jeans, a cotton shirt, pullover, and GP Army issue boots. My brother and I were starting to gather a little knowledge about our quarry as we had sighted at least one deer per weekend. But I should point out it was one deer per our normal team of 3 hunters. Today, the new Sambar hunter has access to reading material, the ADA Hunter Education course at Rawson, and there is a plethora of experienced Sambar hunters and quality deer publications from organisations like the Australian Deer Research Foundation, from which to gain knowledge. Recently, I met up with a young Sambar hunter in the Wanangata Valley. He had just shot a stag while stalking a gully 10 minutes in front of me. He said it was his first trip in the valley and his second Sambar hunt. As he came from Sydney, his opportunity to hunt Sambar had been limited, and he went on to tell me he had completed the Rawson course and decided to give it a go. So you never know. Sign up and learn. It might be your lucky year. For the first 18 months, none of our hunting parties shot any deer, although we were passing up hinds. We had convinced ourselves we were doing something wrong, as part from the family of deer that I had seen on our first hunt, no one had seen a stag. Eventually I broke the ice in the dry river area, and it seemed rather ironic, as the stag was not all that far from my first encounter 18 months before. I must confess that I had finished hunting and was returning to the four-wheel drive just before dark when I noticed a silhouette of a deer 100 metres above the track I was walking on. Raising my brother's 7mm Rem mag, I could see the deer's antlers through the scope. With the crosshairs wobbling all over the place, I fired. The stag staggered forward 30 metres and fell. I ran up to it and finished the job. This 30-inch Sambar stag was the first deer any of us shot. On the weekend, the hound hunters, as well as other stalkers, were common in the Wanangata. However, during the week, it was usually very quiet, and we often had the valley to ourselves. Kevin and Jared Cullen joined my brother John and me on a memorable camp in the Wanangata. We soon learnt where the biggest bog holes were and travelled up and down the valley with precision timing. The campfires were big enough to burn all night and half the next day. Approximately every third trip, a deer was taken for meat. However, taking a deer was never a priority. Just being in the bush was the highlight. I will never forget a 2-week Sambar hunt in Gatta, on which we were joined by Rodney, who had his Toyota tray loaded to the roof, complete with lounge. Anyone for a Coke was the most used question uttered for the 2 weeks. Before the 2 weeks were out, we were forced to do a mercy run out the other end of the valley to Myrtleford for more Coke. During the camp, some peanut tried to drive his F100 ute up the Widowmaker Hill alongside the old homestead site. There was no formed track up this hill, and it was an area where it seemed that any and all hoons would have to prove that their four-wheel drive could go anywhere. Some motorbikes could make it up to the top, spin their machines around and come down again. I had one of my bikes at the top when I was a young larrikin, but I wouldn't even think about trying it in a vehicle. Anyway, this fellow and his good-looking daughter was stuck halfway up, and the F100 was side on. He had tried to turn around but bailed out and came to our camp for help. We all went up the hill in the dark and managed to get his truck down safely. A few years later, 2 people were killed trying the same stunt in their Land Rover when it rolled to the bottom. Rodney had success on the deer when on this camp. It wasn't long after this trip But the army arrived in the valley. What bloody army, I hear you ask? The Shepherd and Sambar hunters arrived in their restored Army 351 V8 Dodge weapon carrier. Owner-driver Hawley and Graham, or as his mates called him, Gambo. It turned out that Gambo had been our school teacher at Bairnsdale Tech College. These fellows had been hunting Sambar when we were still at school. We would stick it up Gambo while on these camps for not teaching us about Sambar before we left to join the workforce. The army became a familiar sight in the gutter, and the weapon carrier would turn up in the middle of the night with blackberries hanging off the bull bar. We would call on Gambo's camp and they called on us. There was lots of hunting done around the campfires and plenty of refreshments consumed. Our clan was in the gutter when Gambo shot a very nice stag towards the end of a 5-day camp. He had been hunting the high country most of the week and was sick of gut busting, so he stalked the river flat up the Myrtleford end of the valley and secured his best ever Sambar. He came back to camp on cloud 9 and with one heck of a smile on his face. We all had a drink before going back down the valley to pick up his deer in my brother John's tray back to Erda. Gambo directed John to drive through the scrub to get closer to the animal, pushing through the waist-high bracken fern, and then suddenly thump. "This is it," Gambo said. John backed up and shone his headlights on a massive-bodied stag. It took the four of us a lot of grunting to get the animal on the back of the Toyota Holers Bowlers. I think everyone slept in the following day, and why not? Gambo and his army buddies, Hawley and Morris, turned up one night in the gutter, driving a 6-wheel drive, mean-looking green machine with a tray on the back, big enough to carry half a house. However, the only things on the tray were a very large wooden box and a huge anti-aircraft military shell, 3 feet long. The shell looked as real as the ammunition I was using in my .270 rifle. I could not help wondering what these wild boys were up to. Bottled beer did not travel very well in the Shepherd and Boys army rig, and their answer was to strap a 9-gallon keg on the tray, complete with gas and accessories. Yes, the boys enjoyed a beer after the hunt. The Wonnangatta Valley is an ideal place to hunt Sambar if you intend to spend a week or more, as you have unlimited areas to hunt. It is 20 miles long, with hundreds of gullies on both sides and excellent flats. Each day, the hunting routine began with a floundering through the bog holes to reach your hunting area, unless you hunted from your camp, where there was always plenty of deer activity. Just over the nearby Wonnangatta River, this also provided a nice trout for entree on many occasions, and I should be familiar with army trucks as I completed national service. And I think Bruce Hall's truck was a blitz. One thing is for sure, there was no stopping these boys from driving their green machines through the scrub. One of their priorities was to drive their rigs as close as possible to where the deer was dispatched. Walls of blackberries, logs, even trees were no obstacles. One evening, the blitz rumbled into camp with what looked like half an acre of scrub hanging off the machine. This was a fair indication that someone had shot a deer. And sure enough, Gambo shot a spiker while hunting in his favourite gully on the dry side of the valley. This spot became known as Gambo's Gully. There was Bruce's Gully, Disappointment Flat, Don Rhodes area, and Jared's Gully. No one picked out spots for my brother or me. We spent so much time in the valley, we were branded with Barry Gatter. That night, there was a celebration into the early hours, and I can still see Gambo climbing a huge log that was sticking out of the fire. I thought our clan had big fires. Just when everyone was finally relaxing a little, Hawley snuck around from behind a tent and threw the 3-foot military shell into the fire. There were bodies going in all directions, coming out of tents half clad with their worldly possessions in hand. The camp must have been evacuated for a 100-metre radius. There was a smaller explosion than was anticipated, and then everybody returned to pick up their deck chairs and abuse Hawley for his prank. The next morning, we were woken by what sounded like an earth tremor. However, later learned that it was only one of Gambo's mates playing with incendiary bombs. Our early Sambar hunting sojourns were challenging adventures and sometimes humorous and will never be forgotten.